Welcome to the lecture for Unit 6 on Early Christian Architecture. Before viewing this lecture, you should have completed the reading in Chapter 6 in the Buildings Across Time book, the chapter titled Early Christian and Byzantine Architecture. As always, these lectures are meant simply to supplement the information that you've already learned in the required readings. When you're ready to view this lecture, please advance to the next slide. Remember to click on the audio icons to receive the audio content for each slide. From the height of the Roman Empire, in about the year 211, until the map of Europe shown here, the Roman Empire began to slowly unwind. Perhaps it had reached a size too difficult to keep together, but for whatever reason, by around the year 300 the Roman Empire was changing. One of the most dramatic changes to the empire was a change in religion, from the pagan religions of many gods to the emergence of a new religion, Christianity. Slowly, as the problems of civic and governmental architecture began to be solved, the focus of building began to shift to the new problem of how to house communal groups of worshippers needed for this new religion. Another change occurred around the year 330, when Constantine relocated the center of Roman bureaucracy from Rome to the old Greek city of Byzantium, located at the mouth of the Black Sea. The new capital was called Constantine's city, or Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul, Turkey. This split in the empire would continue to stress the already fragile Roman Empire, eventually even splitting the church that this new religion represented. The empire faced numerous threats from invading forces from all directions, but the greatest force reshaping the Roman Empire was that of Christianity. New religion, new beliefs, and new values brought the need for a new type of architecture to respond to the values of the people. Early Roman architecture often addresses the need for public buildings to serve the needs of the Roman Republic lifestyle. The basilica is an early building type that served this need. Basilicas were originally designed as buildings to house legal proceedings. The basilica features a large interior space where judges could hear cases and the public could listen. The Basilica of Olpia fits this model. It was designed as a long rectangular space with an apse, or half-circular space at each end, where judges could sit and listen to cases. These buildings were usually found adjacent to the forum, or public square. They featured a colonnade on each side, covered by a wood-framed timbered roof, this one spanning about 80 feet. As the need for spaces to house Christian worship services arises, the Romans would turn to the basilica building type as a model for Christian church building. Unlike the pagan Roman religions, where offerings to the gods were often done on an individual basis at the temple, the Christian faith is based on rituals where large groups of people congregate together on a regular basis. Because these beliefs and worship patterns are different, a new type of building was necessary for religious ceremonies. The basilica model, which previously was used for other civic functions, fit the need well. One of the largest basilicas in Rome, Old St. Peter's, was built on the Vatican Hill outside the city, on the site where St. Peter is believed to have been buried. This basilica contains all of the organizing elements that will be repeated in cathedral architecture for quite some time. It has a narthex, or an entry vestibule, a nave, which is the central space, with clerestory windows above, side aisles with lower ceilings, to put the focus on the altar, a transept, or a cross shape, symbolic in Christian faith, and an apse, again at the end, to focus attention on the altar. Old St. Peter's can really be considered the first real Christian architecture. Its form is not only symbolic of a cross shape, but it's based on the liturgy itself. It allows for a processional to occur, and has spaces for the congregation to sit and participate in the ceremony. As we discussed in the previous slide, it has all of the pieces that we'll see in church building for the next 1,000 years. The entry bay is called the narthex. The main central space is called the nave. It's the tallest volume, and often has clerestory lights to bring in natural daylight from above. Churches often have side aisles, which are lower bay spaces, often darker, to focus attention to the center, on the altar. The transept, or the cross-shaped space, and an apse at the end, which again is the half-circular space which focuses the attention back to the altar. If you remember back to the Pantheon, which we discussed in the previous lecture, it's a circular space with a dramatic dome overhead. This type of centralized architectural plan still survives, and it survives as a model for early Christian buildings as well. In the western part of the Roman Empire, this more centralized planning was typically used for Christian mausoleums. In the east, which we'll see a little bit later, the centralized plan becomes the favored building type for religious architecture. Santa Costanza is a mausoleum for Constantine's daughter, Constantina. It's a circular space pierced at the top by 12 large windows, capped by a dome. The exterior of Santa Costanza is exceedingly plain, whereas the interior is ablaze with mosaics and colored marble. External appearances in early Christian buildings were of little consequence. The interior, like the soul, was the focus of concern. In the year 402, the Roman Empire becomes divided between East and West, and the town of Ravenna in Italy becomes the capital of the Western Roman Empire. Because of this, we'll find two excellent examples of early Christian architecture located in Ravenna. The first is San Apollinare Nuovo. This basilica has all of the characteristics of early Christian architecture. The idea of interiority, or the fact that the focus is not so much on the external appearances of the space, but rather on the internal. It's transcendent, meaning beyond ordinary limits, slightly beyond comprehension. The idea of immateriality. The focus is not so much on the materials of the space, but on the spiritual presence. The space itself goes beyond the material. And the concept of light. Early Christian architecture relied heavily on light to indicate a divine presence. In this case, and in most basilicas, light is brought through clerestory windows and represents the idea, or symbolic of the idea, of rising to the light. Unlike Greek or Roman temples, which were meant to be admired, early Christian basilicas were meant to be experienced, transporting the worshipper from the hardships of everyday life to the heavenly experience of the cathedral interior. The other early Christian example in Ravenna is San Apollinare in Classe. This structure also has all of the key characteristics of early Christian architecture. Again, the idea of interiority, the concept of transcendent space, the idea of immateriality, and the use of light to equal a divine presence. This space also has the typical components of early cathedral architecture. This image, we're looking directly down the nave or central space, which again usually was the high-volume space with light coming through clerestory windows above. This particular space has no transept, but notice how the altar is in the center, and it's raised slightly on a podium. It also has an apse at the end, which focuses our attention back on the altar. So let's take a look at this structure in terms of form, site, and meaning. Its form. It's a simple, utilitarian exterior form. It's built out of brick, tile, has a timber roof structure, and flat ceilings. The interior, however, has richly elaborate mosaic tiles. It's the typical basilican plan and section. Its site. It's located in the capital of the Western Holy Roman Empire, and it was built during a period where many people were converting to Christianity. Its meaning. The form of the basilica responds directly to the liturgy, or concepts of the Christian liturgy. The idea of movement down the nave. The concept that life's path towards redemption. That living a Christian life leads to an eternal life. It's also important for the progression of converts. It's also symbolic of Christian principles, the importance of the soul, or the concept of interiority, and the idea that heaven transcends the materiality of life. And of course, the symbolism of light. Light equaling a divine presence, really light being symbolic of heaven. By the time San Apollinare was built in the mid-500s, the western half of the Roman Empire had been overrun several times by Germanic peoples from the north. Only in the east, near the emperor in Constantinople, did the borders remain relatively firm. The Roman Empire in the east endured and achieved its pinnacle of cultural and political importance during the reign of Justinian, who came to the throne in 527. Justinian's two most lasting achievements were that of the codification of Roman law, or the Justinian Code, and that of church building. After a failed revolt in the year 532, Justinian set out to rebuild the destroyed Hagia Sophia, or Church of Holy Wisdom. The rebuilt structure was to be a centralized structure on a vast scale, partially as a monument to his rule, and as a celebration of his victory. Justinian erected a building that would become a new model for sacred architecture. The Hagia Sophia is still considered one of the greatest masterpieces in the history of architecture. Justinian hired two philosophers from Greece, known for their studies in theoretical geometry, Anthemius and Isidorus. Only they could design the type of ethereal building that Justinian wanted. The exterior of the building, like in other early Christian buildings, is of secondary importance. It was the interior that is of significance. The interior of Hagia Sophia attempts to be both centralized and axial at the same time. In other words, the space is longitudinal, or linear, but appears to be centralized because it's dominated by the vast dome on top. The dome is really the focal point of the interior space. It's 186 feet tall and 103 feet across. To compare that to the Pantheon was 142 feet across its dome, but it was much lower in its volume. The dome itself is covered with gold leaf and mosaic. All of the surfaces of the interior church are pierced with windows, even the base of the great dome. So from the interior, the dome seems not to rest on solid masonry, but to symbolically cover the space with its golden dome suspended from heaven. It was exactly this type of symbolic architecture that early Christians were looking for, a spiritualized interior space of unsurpassed beauty. You can see from the floor plan in the upper left of this slide how the interior spaces of Hagia Sophia attempt to be both axial and linear, as well as centralized at the same time. The key element of this space is the dome, which is located centered atop a square space. The construction technique for this is called a dome on pendentives. This allows a round dome to be placed on a square volume, and the pendentives transfer the load outward to the columns. While not as broad as the dome of the Pantheon, the central dome of the Hagia Sophia rises from a ring that's already 120 feet in the air. The first dome erected collapsed in 558. It was rebuilt at a steeper slope in 562. The dome partially collapsed again in the 9th and 14th centuries. Part of the structural challenges at Hagia Sophia is that Hagia Sophia lacks the resistance to the outward thrust that the dome of the Pantheon has. If you remember back to the previous unit, the exterior walls of the Pantheon were as much as 20 feet thick in certain places. At Hagia Sophia, a dome of almost the same scale sits on a very thin ring, suspended 120 feet up in the air, supported only by the pendentives and the four massive columns. To the Byzantine mind, this structure is perfect. The cube, surmounted by a dome, was a model of the universe, the earth, covered by the dome of heaven. In Hagia Sophia, Justinian gave definitive form to Byzantine architecture, merging Roman construction with Greek science. More importantly, however, is the idea of symbolic light. I think a quote from the court poet at the opening of the structure sums up the ideas behind Hagia Sophia. And I quote, "When the first gleam of light rosy-armed, driving away the dark shadows, leapt from arch to arch, then all the princes and people with one voice hymned their songs of prayer and praise. It seemed to them as if the mighty arch were set in heaven. And above all rises into the immeasurable air the great hamlet, which, bending over like the radiant heavens, embraces the church. The golden stream of rays pours down and strikes the eyes of men, so they can scarcely bear to look. Thus, through the spaces of the great church come rays of light, expelling clouds of care, filling the mind with promise, showing the way to the living God."